Hi, my name is Benedict. Today's video is actually walking through a mix that I've done for a tech house style track. I encountered Guy Produce on KVR's music forum, and he presented this. He said he's made a tech house style track, but doesn't feel like he's got anywhere with the mixing. He says he hasn't started the mixing, but I think he had, because what he's got here is essentially mixed. Now, the first thing that we'll do before I go into my opinion stuff, because you all know I like to take the time to express myself, because I think it's in the little things that you learn stuff. I think it's only fair that we play the track. This is the quickly mastered mix that I did. So there's the whole piece of music as I've mixed it and how I finished it. Now the aim with the rest of this video, which will, as I've suggested earlier, be long, because there's a lot involved in this, and I know that there's certain parts of the community that sort of think that, oh well, mixing's easy. Mixing can be done, like you can do a good mix in an hour. I do not agree with those people. They're people who are striving to please a certain mindset of a certain customer who's more interested in the dollars than they are in the art and what they're getting for said dollars. Odd irony is that those are the people who often easily spend $150 buying a new synth because it's got, 1,000 presets guaranteed to make you pro, but don't want to spend $20 getting a mix done, which is kind of insane, because you can make a great track and a great mix using sounds that most people would say were shit. But it doesn't matter how great your sounds are if you haven't written a good piece. So I'm going to run through a lot of the background, and this is a $500 mix. This is the way a $500 mix is approached, not the way a $30 mix is approached, even though they will tell you it's the same. The difference between the mindset of somebody who's doing mixes for $30 is that they want to get it out the door in an hour, which means that it's all about formulas, saying, well, they're bad frequencies, so we'll just cut them out regardless. You'll see that I work the other way around, which is to say, well, what's the feeling? What have I got to sell here? What's the artist trying to say? What have I got to help him sell? So we will pop aside a mixer for the moment, pop aside our sequencer for the moment. Pop a mixer, thank you. We'll go look at the rack. There's quite a lot of stuff happening in here. I've got all the tracks, laid them all out in the sequence. Actually, we'll run back over the sequencer just for a moment, because it helps you understand where I've come from. I got a lot of tracks. Unfortunately, I got them all alphabetical order. They're all named. You can see that they are named for what they do, but they were all in alphabetical order. Tip to the wise, when you're going to send stems across to somebody, you've probably got your kick drums and your snares and what have you at the top. So if you'd label them all O1 kick drum, O2 snare, it's going to mean that when I get them and throw them into my door, they're all in the right order. Now that order is going to be your sense, not necessarily mine, but at least they're in a sense order, because let me tell you, A to Z is actually not a relevant order for the tracks. But thank you, they were all well named, so that is good. So I took them, put them all in, then dragged them into order. The second bit of housekeeping is to make sense of things, exactly the same as I did with the fighter kite track bitter. I made things so that they're in groups, so they start to make sense. So rather than looking at the 30 or so tracks that I've got, I can start by looking at the groups. So I take all the drum sounds, put them in something that seems like the right order, and bus them all to something just called drums. So if I want to listen to drums alone, there you go, drums alone. Ain't nothing but what's happening with the drums. If I want to get rid of the drums, I can just mute them. Obviously I need to be somewhere else in the piece for that to be a valid move, but nonetheless, really important place to start. Your mix engineer needs to feel in control. Help him feel in control, help him see where you're coming from, but number one thing is be in control, take the time. So it takes about an hour to do. So if I've budgeted 1 hour, if I'm one of those fools who sell time, like a car park or something, then that hour is gone already, which means that they're now no longer in the mindset, because you've already taken them into overtime for which they are not being paid. Find somebody who builds per the mix and doesn't bill light. Basses go together. Good reason. Now I actually ended up taking something that was called a bass and moving it into the melodic section, because it behaves more like a melodic sound than a bass, even though it's in the bass register. Personal decision, helped it to make sense for me. A couple of times where sounds belong together, I'd pair them together, submix them. And in this case, the vox go to a vocal sub, and then that goes straight off to the sound effects. So quite simplistically, if you have a look at my rack here, you can see that each one of these racks, I've got all the masters, we've got the drums and the basses, put a little divider to help me see the difference, melodic sounds, and as you'll see, even though there are possibly more drum tracks, there's a lot more emphasis that goes on the melodic sounds, which runs contrary to a lot of the mindset that you see inside forums. They say, oh, but the drums are everything. Let me tell you, that is a pile of poo. The reason that you can tell this is because effectively every track has drums. Therefore, drums are a dime a dozen. Like in a heavy metal record, guitars are a dime a dozen. Drums are a dime a dozen. And seeing most of them these days come off drum machines or sample sets that are freely available and commonly used over and over, they're the same bloody drums anyway. So the only thing that differentiates those is the programming of the patterns and what have you. And if you're looking at EDM where it's all, we haven't got a hell of a lot to differentiate ourselves there in a drum pattern. Therefore, the differentiator in a piece of music is always what's going on top. Even if you draw the person predominantly to the drums, it's what's going on top is where your magic in your mix lies, and you'll see me make a few mixed decisions around this thinking. So, melodic sounds, and then we've got our sound effects, which are, in this case, vocals. It's not a song, so these vocals are a sound effect. They have some little bit of narrative, but it's small and it's incidental. Clever and cool and effective. But it's not welcome to the Hotel California. That's okay. This is a deep house track. I know they call it tech house, couldn't give a shit. It's deep house. If you want to then say it's tech house underneath that, more power to you, but it's deep house. It's house and it's deeper than that. Ordinary house, pop house, deep house. Deep house. So, all arranged, all laid out. That takes at least an hour to do, because it needs to be done intelligently. Intelligently with regards to the piece of music that's being mixed. To just say, oh, all those basses go in basses, is not intelligent, as we'll see later. And then, of course, just some masters over here. Now, what you heard was my quick master, which we will turn off and we'll put back to mix mode. Mix mode, ignore the reverb for the moment. Mix mode is turning the volume down, because the last thing we want is for when I bring all these tracks up, I don't know what I've got, I don't want them going splat, 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 because that splat, splat, splat may actually be a sound that I end up liking and becoming welded to, even though it's hearing digital analog to converters in my system trying to cope with too much happening, which of course won't translate to anybody else's system. So turn the volume down, make sure nothing's happening. I always have a limiter across the ads, simply because it's not good form to send splats out through your system. I'm always having a look, is this doing anything when I'm mixing? If it's doing something, I'm mixing wrong. Do not mix into a limiter. I know people tell you it's the coolest thing, and yes, if you've got to the point where you can mix into a limiter, do it. It's still, I think, bad form, because you're relying on the limiter, not on your skills. But if you're watching this, you're probably wanting to learn something, in which case, don't mix into a limiter, ever. If you see it happening, turn at least your master control down, because you can never get natural balance, and you need to learn natural balance before you can get good at doing other stuff. And I don't care if people say, oh, but in EDM you do mix into a limiter. No, mixing into a limiter is a bad thing and explains the poorness of balance in a lot of EDM tracks that you hear. Send me grenades if you want, I'm not interested. Okay, what I got across was included some masters. I'm not quite sure what the master, dry and wet mean, but they're there. So, if we go back to... Sorry, I'm used to working on two screens. It's tricky for me working on one screen, hence my confusion trying to work out, well, okay, what do I do here? How do I do this best? So, probably I'll split my screen again. A little bit of screen. Kick drum, everybody's favorite thing in the whole world. So let's... Oh, it's such a narrow world. I get used to it. So, kick drum. We'll start here because it's the center of the EDM universe, and I know you want to hear it. So, yes, the volume has gone down a little bit overall from where it was before. Remember, that's where I've turned it down with this. That is why, if you've bought remotely wisely, you will have bought, which you can't see here, a audio at device, USB doohickey, with a nice big volume knob on it. Hopefully that volume knob is a VCA, not just a digital bit reducer. So nice volume knob, so you set your master system up, your speakers or your amplifier or whatever, to have a louder volume than you'll ever need, but not excessive, but just a bit more than you'll ever need. And then when you're mixing and you pull back your volume so that you're not hitting the red, you can turn your speakers up a bit, but do not work loud, ever. You'll blow your hearing. You make your ears tired and then you find you can't hear stuff. So we have a kick. We'll pop that in solo for the moment. Let's reference quickly against... This is the original mix that he sent across. Now we're working mostly with the kick drum for the moment. So let's just kill that. Kick drum. So what did I do with the kick drum? If you're listening on proper system in your studio, which really you should be if you're wanting to get anything from this, and please not headphones, these things are bloody awful. I can't hear much in the way of bass on these at all. And I don't care what you say, again, headphones are a dangerous environment to mix in. So, whilst the original kick drum is quite bassy, I know that what it needs is punch. Bass is slow. Higher frequencies are faster, increasingly faster as they go high. So we need that kick drum, because it has to be through the whole track. We need to get that speaking higher. It's easy to think that its role is about, but that's what we've got basses and subs for. And even there you'll see we'll behave differently. We need to pull that up so that it has punch. And punch has to be fast. If you want to try that for yourself, get a friend, tell them what you're about to do, and punch them really slowly. How hurt do they feel? Not very much at all. Not very much at all. So the problem with bassy instruments, where you're trying to think that you're going to win with huge amounts of bass, is that you are punching slowly. So at most, the person goes, but they're right back up at you. punching has to be fast. And the crispier that is, the more punch the person will feel. So, to achieve said effect, I've really had at this with a compressor. Really fast attack. I just want to ram this down. Fairly fast release, but I'll let through virtually nothing. A millisecond means that there's going to be a tiny bit of thing, but it's pulling up the whole body of the kick, and you'll also hear it's raising the tone of the kick. So we've gone from trying to swing something big and slow to swing something quite a bit faster. So we've sped up our punch. So it works a lot better as a result. That's the first thing that we've done. A lot of the other bits and pieces I've left fairly well as they are. The claps. Oh, look at EQ, sorry. You're going to want to see what I did. No EQing at all. But let's have a look at the difference this makes. Sorry, I'm going to just shrink this up a bit. Actually, that's coming before, so you're not going to see the difference. Sorry, this is an unusual way of working for me. So now we've got our claps. So clap 1 and clap 2. You'll see I've gone through, these are two separate samples, and I've found what is the clappiest bits of them. I know that in house, your claps tend to be about brightness. You tend not to have a snare. In rock, a snare is a fat-bellied thing. In house, if they have a snare, or particularly if they've replaced it with claps because they're brighter, it's about a up here kind of a thing. So I've put a little bit of boost on each of those, but because he's given me a pair of them, I've actually panned them out a bit. Not 100%, because it's just going to make you do this. So out a little bit. Find what works comfortably. The fact that they're different sounds and that I've pulled out slightly different frequencies, but you don't want to pull out radically different frequencies or you're really going to similar. Then that just gives that wider sound. In rock, the snare is commonly very stereo, hyper stereoed, because it makes it seem like, because rock relies on the backbeat. Techno and its variants tend to rely on the front beat, but you still need the backbeat to make it work. So that's all it's done with those. Various sticks and bits and pieces, they're just based on what's needed. There wasn't a lot needed to make them work because he'd already done the mix work. This is needed to make the kicks work. That's your counterpoint to that. Now, very tempting to make those really bright. But while it initially sounds great to have those hi-hats be really bright, they get very wearing on the ear. They need to be very there, but don't let them get wearing by being too bright or too loud. The brain will know they're there. Still let the emphasis be on that kick because that's what we're working with here. There is a snare build-up in here. Snare build-up, which is here. Relatively subtle. I tried a few different ways, and this again is the difference between hiring somebody who's trying to get your mix out in an hour, who's selling time rather than selling an outcome. Somebody who's selling an outcome will take the time to be creative and try different things. Was that snare build-up supposed to really dominate everything? Was it supposed to be something that kind of sat underneath and just kind of gave you a lift without you necessarily focusing on it? Hard to say. That's sort of up to the composer. But as a mixer, when I come in and I'm asked to make my mix, then I've got to think, well, where do I want that to be? I actually found that I pulled it back because there was other stuff going on that was more important. So you can hear it for sure.
Money and drugs. That's what I love.
But we don't have a snare in the mix all the time. So if we were to introduce that snare roll super loud, it's an instrument that wasn't there before, it can jar. And I appreciate that a build-up like this is meant to jar to some extent, but it's also a transition. So while we've got several things going on in there, I'm happy for that to sit inside the mix and not say, hello, look at me, I'm suddenly playing snares. They're just part of what's going on. What happened was I put them through some tape drive, enough to fatten those sounds up, and then to actually put the compressor in to kind of chop them up a little bit as well, because you've got to keep those snare sounds choppy, otherwise they just become a there's already sound noise in here as well. But by doing it both, I've beefed them up, which allows me to run them quieter. So each sound on its own is more manly, but allows them to sit a little bit lower in the mix. If they were in a classic 808 type snare, which is really short and really snappy, then they're going to need to be a lot louder to pull through the mix, which means they start to become dominant or intrusive. They're like, we don't want that. We're not trying to poke somebody in the eye here. We've got that kick drum to keep doing this. So I've turned them into what I always used to refer to in my early days of EBM, slug bars. So they're like, which makes that sound more solid, therefore is able to lower in volume while still having more impact. Little tiny bit of goosey on the EQ, letting through a lot of the highs, tiny bit of the tape compression that happens in here, as I said, just to body it up. And then speaking of body, I've used this resonator very mildly, but a little tiny bit of the resonator in here to give those sounds a unique character. One of the downsides of sourcing all of your sounds from electronic devices is they can sound quite samey. You put 3 acoustic guitars in a room, chances are they're from different manufacturers or they've been tuned different ways, but each one of those is actually going to have a slightly unique character to it. Even if they're exactly the same guitar, just the way that somebody holds it, the amount of padding in their belly affecting the resonance box is going to create a uniqueness for each of those 3 guitars. But with electronic sounds, they tend to not have had the chance to develop that uniqueness. This resonator section applies a little bit of uniqueness. Too much and it whines. Little bit just adds a layer of character that wasn't there before. And then that compressor, as I said, just to gap the sounds back out again. Stick between hits. This one's an interesting one. You may have noticed it through the mix. You'll see that we've got some funny things happening here. Let's solo this fella out. This is between your kick and snare, a little bit of EQ just to pull it out. Yes, boys and girls, I brought in elements of dub. I'm not messing with genres here. It was merely that this is a thing that repeats all the time. And one of the problems with things that repeat all the time is that we stop hearing them. Because we go, yeah, I know it's there. I don't need to focus any extra attention on it because it's no longer unique. I've heard it 8 times already. Same. I'll lower the amount of attention my brain gives to this because it doesn't change. So here I've added in a delay. It's set up so that when this is off, you hear no echoes. When this is on, which is what you see here, turning on, off, then it adds in the echoes. And then on the end of the phrase where we've got some gaps, I turn that feedback right up so that it starts to roll on and build. So that allows you to have...
The only thing tonight that we have is us. Us.
It smooths over our sections whilst adding some interest because we can't rely on it being the same all the time. Sneaky little bastard. Spent quite some time setting this up. Now that's not to say look how clever I am, but because I'm not thinking about the hour, I'm thinking about the result. And that means that I'll take the time to set that up and make it feel good. That one doesn't do a lot. That just adds something else to the hi-hat pattern, so we don't need to fuss on that. This fella was really important. Now, when I very first heard that track in the forum, I'm not massively big in this genre. Most of it I find bores me to hell, and so I turn it off because it doesn't do anything interesting. But when I very first pressed play on that SoundCloud link, it did something that I was like, ooh, that's different. And because it was different, I listened to the end of his piece. This is a massive, massive thing to learn here. Because it was different, and because it was unique. Not massively so, but it was unexpected. So I went, oh, that was cool. It wasn't unexpected bad. It wasn't like he started his song with a farting sample or something stupid. He started with something really simple, but arrested my attention. Now, when I got these bits to mix, or when I got these stems to mix, and we talked about this already in the forum chat, he'd added even more stuff in terms of what he sees as being the rules of setting up, what in the old days we called the 12-inch mix, the disco mix of the track, so that it had the mix breaks there for the DJ to work his way in and out of the track. Now, having grown up through the late 80s, this was the era of the 12-inch. I know kids later think that they invented it, but no, it was really through the 80s that the 12-inch was being explored, and they were learning all the lessons that you had to learn about the 12-inch, including the devices that the DJs wanted for mix breaks, for lacing. But the good 12-inch mixers also realized that there were going to be people who would get those 12-inch records, because sometimes it was the only way you could find them, and they would record them off onto a mix cassette, which was just like a whole pile of songs in a row, a playlist. And we would be listening to the 12-inch versions of the song. So they started writing those 12-inch versions to be listenable. When the stems came across, Guy had added the mix break parts, the intro and outro in particular, but they were bald. So it's just kick, 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 kick. It's dull, Guy. It really is dull. Now, he's not the only guy that does this. The guy's not very far in his career producing, but you've got to add some stuff in. Now, Guy hasn't heard this before now. I deliberately didn't send him the mix. I told him it was done, but he wasn't going to get it. Because there are some surprises in here. If he'd been sitting beside me when he started hearing this, I would have got one of two reactions. He would have either gone, "You changed my piece, man," and gotten bent out of shape about it. That's my job. Not to change his notes and stuff. I've done very little of that. But to, in this case, fill in the holes, so to speak. So what I very first heard was this. Just that snare. Sorry, not the snare, the cymbal. It's just the cymbal that it's got that pulse to it. Without listening to it close, I thought, oh, he's just kind of put an echo on the cymbal. You don't do that. But that was cool. Got my attention. Made me listen to the rest of the track. When this came across, not only was there no cymbal, but there was all this space. So, very first thing I did was took the reason that I had even listened to this track in the first place and put it back, which was a cymbal. And then I realized that cymbal doesn't have that thing going on. So I had to work out how he'd done it. Went back, had a listen, realized it wasn't a delay. But it sounded a lot like the side chaining thing that you hear and everything. Now I loathe that, but it's effective. So, I happen to do some beta work with this. This is a Reason device, but I'm sure there are things in VST world. If not, you just do it manually. So what this fella does is, well, you can watch it just as we go through. It's just a volume curve that we apply, which acts like a sidechain. So in this case, at the beginning of the period, it starts with the volume low and then allows it to pump back up. And in this case, I've pulled it back down a little bit because I want to really emphasize that pumping. That's all it does. Here, I want that to be really pronounced. It's like, oh, I want to catch people's attention. You'll see it now turns itself off. And it's like the world's longest cymbal, which is great. It's perfectly suited to this, and I actually like it. So, because it's the same sound all the way through, it doesn't have different cymbals, and nor does he need to, I've just added instances where this processing is happening 100%, times where it's not happening at all. You hear that cymbal clean and smooth. Other times where it's half and half. Actually, no, the half and half is when there are no little blocks. So, this one here. You don't really notice that it has that little pulse in it, but it's there. So, as opposed to this fella, so those little differences, just like with the side stick, help keep that crash relevant. And it's put back the interesting bit at the beginning, which you'll also notice, or you probably won't notice, but Guy will notice, is that I added in a couple of other little bits and pieces. Not fresh bits and pieces. It's not for me to write new stuff, unless I'm asked to, or I get permission. That I've taken... It's down here. I've taken some of the vocal, which we'll talk about more, and popped that at the beginning. Not a lot, but just enough to keep some interest in that extra. I think it's a minute that he's whacked on the beginning of. So the thing to do is to always take some of the interesting bits from the guts of the piece and show them early on. Just like if you go to a house of ill repute, they will show you that you're likely to see certain types of things. So we show some of what's in the piece early. And that just helps draw people in. And while I'm not big on the subject matter, that line, drugs, that's a winner in this case. So we pull those forward to make those Mix breaks, listenable, enjoyable to listen to, cool to listen to. That's the art of the remix, so to speak. Loop effects didn't do anything with that. It's a loop. It does its funky chain gang thing. Did roll off some unnecessary lows and some sounds. My drums are all bust. Once I'd got those drums working, I was working on a dry mix, as in I had no reverb, no anything that you haven't seen here. You might have noticed that in my master I had this reverb. I put this in actually early on in my mix. Once I got to the point of having my drums where I felt I wanted them to be, they were dry. I then considered, well, do I put them all to ascend? And I started that way, and I thought, no, I don't want to do that in this case. I will put the whole mix through this reverb. So I set that up to work nicely for the drums. So if we just take our drums and solo them, put them through this. Now I didn't mix into this reverb. Remember, this reverb was not here as I was doing all the mix. I then added this. As you A/B, you can think, oh geez, you've kind of overdone that a little bit, especially in cans, because cans give you the wrong idea about reverb. But we're looking just for that little bit of extra bigness and sense of space. I've used a pretty coarse room, a little bit of pre-delay. You don't want too much pre-delay because this is all about rhythms, and if you end up with your pre-delay being too far, then it becomes a rhythmic element as it's in itself, and we've got enough rhythmic here because house is about being minimal, and the deeper you go, often the more minimal it is. So a little bit of reverb across the whole mix. So this is going to appear on everything, but if it's right for the drums, it's right for everything. And I knew that that was going to be the case, so reverb decisions I made for other instruments we're now all going to go through here. No dramas with that at all, so that's switched in. That becomes a solid state part of the mix. That's all our drums done. Next stage is basses. Basses are a little all over the place in this, but that's okay. This is house music, and they tend to do it this way. So we've got, okay, here's where they are. Okay, we've got a main bass, which oddly starts with this, with a drone. In his mix, this was not really audible. Problem with that is that it might be great if you've got a sub, but you can guarantee that most people listening to this track do not have a sub. So if you're listening to this and can't hear that well enough, it's mixed wrong. He has it rise, which is kind of cool, and does some interesting stuff. Not quite sure what he did with it, but finally it turns into a bass line. Interestingly, when he's made it actually cycle around in stereo. I didn't mess with that. In my version of the master, I narrow very slightly, but there's not a lot happening in the bass in terms of stereo-ness, which is, in this case, appropriate. Because when you've got these big heavy basses like that are very bass heavy, then we don't really want to do that. So if we move across to the main bass, let's scroll down and find him here. What did we do? I actually did nothing to it. I added an EQ here. Now, very tempting, I wish I could make that hold. Get in your mind what that looks like. See, you've got your main peak here, and then the second peak, which is your first overtone, is here. Very tempting to say, ooh, I'll whack a great big EQ thing up here. Shelf it and The problem is the bass is slow and it's big. It requires a huge amount of level. Therefore, seeing you have a bandwidth, you've only got between minus about 48 dB and 0 dB that you can work with. It's only this big. If you fill it with bass, you can't put anything else in. Everything else is going to get lost, squished. Not good. So, the trick with bass is don't work with the bassiest part of the bass. And I know for many of you that just seems like the wrongest thing to hear, because you want it to be more, but you don't. Remember when we talked about punching? You don't want to punch somebody slowly, because it's not going to hurt them. They're not going to know they've been punched in the way in which a good punch should make them know they've been punched. You need to be in and out quicker. So, same trick as with the kick. Isolate where your first or possibly second overtone is and put a bit of a boost there. You're better off doing it with a bell curve than you are with that. See how much boost I've got there? Kind of nothing. See how there's very little gain over the zero line, whereas here I've got markedly a lot more gain. So it allows you to push harder. When you're focusing on one of the overtones in the series, human brain being the sneaky thing that it is, it will hear the overtone, realize that it's not the fundamental, and effectively focus on the fundamental and psychoacoustically turn the fundamental up in importance. So it allows you to work with a faster punch and make people feel like they're hearing the slower punch. So it allows you to pull through this, which is a waste, with this. You can also do the same thing with boosts up here. Again, you just find the right part up here somewhere. 2's frequency of 1 to 2, or about 2 is quite common on bass guitars in the 80s. You get that clank that helps pull it through. So don't be afraid to use those. Just get rid of that. But focus on a higher frequency. Really important here. That's all I did with that. He's done most of the processing that he wants to do in the generation of that sound. No need for me to mess around even more. Sub bass. You'll see I've gone completely the opposite direction of what he thinks he wants to have happen here. This sub bass is down in the sort of 40 to 60. And that's great for a sub bass, if you've got a sub. But remember, a high percentage of people listening to this, they don't have a sub. Or if they do, it's set up so wrong that it's not working properly. Not the way that it should from a musician or an audiophile perspective. So I've looked at, well, what role is this really playing here? So I found roughly where it's happening. I've given it a little bit of the expected boost here to put a little bit more happening in here. But then I've actually gone a couple of overtones up. And I know there aren't much in the way of overtones on this because it's pretty sine wavy, but I'm just pushing them, I'm forcing them to be there. Not dramatically, otherwise it's going to start to sound thinner as a result. If you A-B between mine and his, yes, mine does sound thinner. However, it punches harder. And the person who's listening, they'll just go, oh, that's bass here. So it's about learning those, not tricks, but understanding how the human brain works, and also the fact that we've got speakers that most of them don't go much below 100. So why put lots of energy there? Put it where the speaker can work, let the human brain fill in the dots. It will. If you set it up right, it will. It's all illusion. You are giving the illusion that something is happening. Recorded music's not literal. If you approach it literally, you'll get lost. We then got our next layer of bass, which is our bouncier bass.
So never mind what happened yesterday.
Classic 303 type thing. What he's used, I don't know, but classic 303 type thing. But he's kept it dark. So I've given him the bass boost that he's going to want. But I think it becomes a lot more fun when we get to the bouncier bass, which is here. Now note in both of the cases with these 303 lines that I'm not looking to boost here. Guess what? With a 303 you never want to boost down there. Not really. The excitement is actually somewhere here in the mids. Find where it sounds interesting in the mids. Even find where it sounds a little bit bad and push that. And I know that's contrary. As I said before, people will have this, oh, I'm working fast, I have to churn this out in an hour and be done with it so that I can do somebody else's underpaid job. If you're in that mindset, then you're simply going to say, oh, certain frequencies are bad and automatically chop them out. It's a bit like sort of saying, oh, well, I don't like 1,000 hertz, therefore I'll remove it from everything. Just makes no sense. So find what makes your sound interesting and unique, and that often is in those character frequencies that a formula person will tend to tell you, oh, they're bad, because they don't want character, because character is a problem for them. They are people who work to those kinds of formulas. Character is the opposite of what they think is important, largely because they're afraid of it. Go into your instruments, find where they have character, find where they do weird things. You're playing with a bass line, find where it spits and clanks. That's the most interesting part of that bass line. Because you know what? Sine waves are not interesting. They've got one tone. Whereas something with 28 overtones, 4 of which are slightly out of tune, find those 4. Or at least one of those 4. Goose it. I'm not saying add like 18 dB of boost to it. It's going to sound bloody awful. Goose it. So about 1.5 dB. Goose where it's interesting, which allows us that's pulling out the bounce in that, and then emphasize the bounce with a little bit of delay. Just a static set and forget delay just to bouncify it even more. But the real bounce in there is in the EQ, not in the delay. And the EQ is just in saying, here's where this sound is interesting. And goosing that just that tiny little bit. So that's our basses done. Gets us into the melodic parts. This is a funny one. It's kind of intrusive. I'm not saying I dislike it. I actually like it and it's necessary. It's an important part of this piece. We wouldn't work without it. But at the same time, it's a little... And I didn't comment on it in the group, but a few other people did. They said, oh, it's too loud. No, it's not that it's too loud, it's that it was too flat. It didn't have character. So here's where I really went through and pulled out character in it. You'll see I didn't really bother much with EQ in here, because I knew I was going to do stuff to it here. And I got a little bit hardcore with it, man. So first thing I did was I gave it a tiny bit of unison, not enough to be able to hear that it had turned into a super saw, because that's just, yeah, so yesterday. But just enough just to fill it out a little bit. I didn't want to use a chorus, because I want this to have some of that flat static feel, because house tends to be flat. So little tiny bit of a unison or an ensemble chorus will do the same thing. You just want to avoid the swishy thing. I then pushed it into a kind of drive. It's just a case of finding out which sounds the best based on the devices you've got. In this case, I used the tape algorithm. I was very tempted to use the overdrive algorithm, which makes things really bright and papery. But I've used the tape algorithm, and then I've pushed it hard. But hard based on if this was actually still supposed to sound perfect and clean. No, it's starting to break up a little bit. Rolled off some of the highs, but not too much. We don't want it to be super bright. That was one of the problems. The original was super bright, which made it sound aggressive, sound too pointy. It wants to be there, but this is deep house, so everything needs to be kind of subtle. The kick drum is unsubtle. That's but everything else has to have an element of subtlety to it. So we've added a bit of to it, but also rolled some of the higher ends off, giving it a fair bit of that tape compression to just man it up. That's what that did. Then added an echo, so just a delay to it, rolled off some of the highs. You'll see that a lot of the echoes I don't use the modulation on them because I don't want that swishy stereo thing happening. Good for pads, not good for this kind of stuff. But the tape wobble, so in other words just coming back randomly in a different pitch, that works pretty good here because they're all short sounds and you don't really hear that they're stumbling around like drunks behind them. And then I've pushed them through the pulverizer device. Not my favorite device, don't use this a lot, not for my music, because it just tends to make it sound horrible. But for this kind of music, this is what this was designed for. It's designed to take these short, stabby things and beef them up. So a little bit of the compression that it does, a tiny bit of dirt, we're not looking to make this too nasty. Use the filter, give them a little bit of filter movement, because this sound doesn't on its own doesn't have any movement really at all. So it just either he had prepared it in his mix and turned it all off, which was the right thing to do, or he'd just not put enough feel into this sound to make it sit inside his mix. But that's my job. So this is just adding a little bit of movement. Not enough that you're going to notice it. Not enough to big whizzy filter sweeps here. Just to move that sound around a little bit, to keep it interesting so that we keep noticing it without it having to be right there up poking us in the eye.
Well, that's all gone. The only thing tonight that we have is us.
So notice how now that sits inside the framework. The framework being those drums and the bass. That's the framework of this style of music. And these incidental things keep it moving along, but they've got to be inside the framework. So now it's inside the framework, so it works really nicely. There's a second one that comes along a little bit later. This was actually more, where is it there? This was more intrusive than the first. See, I'm just going to turn off all of the sound effects. Where we were. Yep. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad musical line. It's actually good because it adds a little bit more movement, a little bit more variation. Not exactly a counter melody, but that little bit more. That's good. But it feels like it sticks out like a sore thumb, even more than the main plucky lead thing did. But we shouldn't let this get in our way. Musically, it's important. Just haven't found the right sound for it yet. I was given the option to be able to make new sounds, but it wasn't necessary. There's a reason that the composer chose these sounds. Even if he's thinking, oh, it's the best I could find, it's still the one that he felt fitted best. So saying, oh, your sound's shit, I'm going to make ones that are better, it's just really arrogant. People might think I'm arrogant, but I'm not arrogant when it comes to making a song right. So his sound is fundamentally the right sound. We've just got to help that sound express what it's supposed to do. That is my job. So, what did I do? In this case, I actually grabbed a ring modulator. It was the first thing that I did. So we'll turn off the other processing. And this is really take a little bit of time to show you how this works out, because this is how you learn to really transition a sound from being not quite cutting the mustard to fitting in the mix mighty nice. So let's make sure that we got him. Atmosphere there. Actually, I'm going to keep the main one as well, because they are counterpoint to each other. The first thing that did was added a little bit of ring modulation. I could have gone classic Doctor Who kind of ring modulation, but yuck. But by being careful and finding the right point where it just gave it a texture, it suddenly really softens that sound up and makes it feel organic and allows it to fit in our framework. Also, rather than allowing it to be the same every time, remember the rule of is the rabbit needs to be moving for us to see it. So we keep the rabbit moving. I've grabbed an LFO, piped it into this knobby here, got the right range. If it goes too far outside that range, it just doesn't feel comfortable anymore. But somewhere between there and there, if it's constantly moving, you don't know that it's moving, but it makes it organic. So ring mod. It's actually a sine wave. I don't expect you to know this device. Then we've got echoes on our main lead plug. We need them on this as well. Tempting to just say I'll just use the same ones. Yeah, sometimes it's good to send out and use the same thing, or to copy the effects so they're exactly the same. Sometimes it's just not good. Counter melody is contrast. Counter, as in against. This is a conversation. Up top, the first guy says bip, bip, bip. And the second guy says bip, 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 bip back. There's sense in putting them in the same room, which is that reverb we've got running on the master bus, wherever it is. That's forcing them into the same room. So is the fact that I've added a send reverb. So all of these are going to that send reverb, which is actually then being pushed through the reverb on the master bus. Sorry, little distraction there. Back to where I was, back here. This is a conversation. So I've got to bring out a unique character in each of my speakers. There's not much point having Elmo on one side, having a conversation with Elmo on the other side. It's just kind of dull. When Homer Simpson has a conversation with himself, he often ends up having two versions of himself, or angel and devil, and sometimes Homer in the middle. But differentiate. And this is a way of helping to differentiate. So the fact that it's gone through a ring mode, I'll add the delays. So those delays are different. In this case, I wanted to have an actual stereo delay, to have them slightly separate from each other, and where everything else has been synced to tempo, these are not synced to tempo. They're done by feel. So a little bit of difference. I don't want a great big difference. If they're like all over the place, not the right call. So I've just got them a little bit out. High and low pass filters on those. Not a big mix, but just adds a bit of oomph behind that sound. Wasn't fully happy with that sound yet. While it was good and vastly more organic and fit within the framework, much better than the original, still needed an extra something. So I went back to my friend, the resonator. So that's adding some higher frequencies. It just gives that little bit more cut, a little bit more push, because it was a bright and dominant sound before. And what I've done sounds nice, but it retires a little bit. So this pushes it forward a little bit, and it's borrowing from this LFO device and just moving around a little bit. So the pitch, which is the number that defines the point at which it resonates, is just moving a little bit. And that stops it from being same. So it's, when you use resonators, it's nice to move them around a little bit. Because in the guitar, the box, the resonance from that box is different if you're playing an E, open string, to an F. The resonance in that box is slightly different. There's things that are same, but there are things that are different. So you can take synth sounds, which are prone to being quite static, because they don't have a resonator, to giving them a sense of life by using your resonator. Up here. Yes, these two sounds actually became related to each other. They really only work at the same time as each other. So that and that. I added another LFO, and that's actually going off to the pan of these two sounds. You won't really hear it much, but what happens is that those two sounds orbit around each other. So as one goes left, the other goes right. So they orbit. That's simply because I tried doing the let's move them left and right. They didn't seem comfortable that way. Really didn't. But I wanted them that way. Because they needed to be that way from a mix perspective, because just straight down the middle was... It didn't allow them to have the space and the character they needed. So I thought, well, if you don't want to permanently sit here and here, and sometimes you seem as good over there, then why don't I orbit you around? You don't hear it? You don't want to play ping pong with these fellas. Or I'll let them orbit each other. They only happen in that one section together, but it works nicely. Used a tiny bit of this fella, which we'll cover better when we get to the vocals. Just adds a little bit more beef to the this fast. Basically turning the level up, but guy had already made some mixed decisions and sent them to me, and they were basically the right decisions. It's just once I got into the mix, I wanted to finesse them slightly. So this allowed me to do that. I'll explain the nature of this device a little bit later. There's a pluck that appears in the build-up, which is just this fella here. Funny sound because it's off kilter. Its rhythm is different from, like, where house tends to sit very much on the 4, the 16, and the 8th, or the 4th, the 8th, and 16th divisions. This one's got something else happening. I don't know whether it's triplets or whatever. I really didn't look into it. It's not the same. So I pulled that out. Again, mixed decisions have been made on this before it comes to me. And there's other stuff going on around this which you can't hear at the moment because they're off. There are builds, sound effects for builds and what have you. This is a little part of that. It's a subtle part of that. This is more it's acting like a sound effect. Even though it's a pitched sound, it's acting like a sound effect. But this is good composing, actually. It's just adding those little blip, 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 that one of your violin sections might do to help build tension in something. That's what this is doing. I have put the delays and then pushed it into a little bit of drive and flying out, so that it tends to flatten the difference with your delays. The difference between drive compressor with delays after and delays going into the drive compressor is quite different. And when you get it right, putting your delays or even reverbs in front of some kind of drive unit, super cool, really super cool. So that just works as our build. Bass for the second chorus. And as I said, remember I said I moved this out of the bass section. I like this. It's become more of a melodic sound. I've brought back the LFOing device here. The reason I've done this is because it plays exactly the same thing over and over. Matter of fact, you'll notice this whole piece, the bass line, is essentially the same all the way through. There's no melodic movement in this. There's no chord progression. There's no anything. And that's part of deep house. That it's so deep, that it's so minimal, that it's basically all one idea. And that's okay. You've just got to find ways to make that idea stay interesting, make us still want to keep looking at the idea. Which is by making it do sparkly shit. So I've taken his sound, which I like very much, put it into a compressor, really just to tighten it up slightly, just to beef it up a little bit. I could have gotten away without it. It's a very slow attack, fast release, not doing a hell of a lot, but I just wanted to beef it a little bit because I was then going to chop it up. If you did the compression after the chopping, then it probably wouldn't work. Or at least it wouldn't work the same way that this currently does. Don't want that. So, because it repeats, I've made it move in different ways. You barely hear it. You'd have to really be listening. Most people would listen to this track and go, cool track, never even notice that sound gets kind of as it goes through. It just gives it texture. Towards the end, variation. I like it. So I deliberately didn't mess with that bit because it's already given us variety. So don't need to fiddle with what's already right. Otherwise, that would have been arrogant. Pad on second drop. This was a funny one. I really like the sound. The sound's got a great tone in it. So we're focusing on this one here. Again, just a tiny bit of that unison. You don't hear it, you just kind of feel it, that it... I use this saturator just because I've used the other one a lot, so I don't want to keep using the same thing to get the same tone. I quite like this little fella. I tried their main synth and it's like, oh, GUI nightmare. Just far too science experimenty. But when they're separated out like this, a bit science experimenty, but the GUIs work nicely in this format. So really just pushed to add some extra body to it, but it's got a wonderful tone already, so didn't need to mess up with that too much. The other thing was a guy had mixed this super low. And while I kind of get that, it's deep house and nothing else matters and it's all just the kick and what have you. You've written this line, it's a nice line, it's a really nice sound. And by the time we're getting this far into the piece, we've got one idea. You're just asking us to stare at the shiny golf ball for it's about 7 minutes. We really need to add something or make the most of something that is new and different. Beautiful sound. So I've pushed it a lot harder in the mix than Guy did, and that's helped me do that. A little bit of unison into this saturator. Putting the unison in front of the saturator just gives the saturator a slightly more complex thing to be working from. And then into this fella. I started just with this fella and really liked the sound that I'd got. But it was like, no, I need more. It needs to be more interesting. The line itself is not super interesting in the sense that it's not Slash playing in November Rain interesting. It's as simple as everything in Deep House is. So we needed to make the most of the sound. So a couple of layers of saturation and then just a very simple echo, but again with slightly different timing. I don't want this to seem rhythmically complex. I played with it, but it didn't work. It needed to be fairly sort of plodding, but it works nicely in its own way. Which brings us to this one. Now this one might have surprised Guy a little bit because he wasn't at the beginning of the piece at all. But remember, it's roughly a minute of, hands and screen, it's roughly a minute of extra build-up of kick and clap, kick and hi-hat. You know, it's adding all the variants for a DJ to mix, but Guy's not at that point where this is going straight off his computer to Pete Tong or whoever is the hit DJ in Cat these days. It's going from his computer to probably SoundCloud, which means that it's not going into a DJ deck. This is going to people who are going to sit there and listen to it. So as I said before, you've got to keep this interesting. So I've added this in early. I pulled the volume back, so we're still being focused on. But this is a minimal piece. This is possibly one note, but this is a really effective thing to do with strings. High string plays one note or maybe one chord and just holds all the way through a section. It's classic composing. Lots of people use it. So here's where I first encountered it. Nice sound. but it's very static, which means that as a result it feels kind of like it's poking you. It just feels like having someone standing behind you going the whole time. That's not because the music part of it's wrong. As I just said, the music part of it's really right. It's just because the way the sound is handled is not right. And again, he handled it his way in his mix. He's given me the raw stuff, and the raw stuff often does sound bad. That's fine, that's my job. So, work through what did I do to it. Let's bypass all of these fellas. Obviously, it could use some chorusing. I added an ensemble because this is classic old Selena string machine technique to play this single high line. Therefore, let's play to that. So an ensemble will go better than a single or some variant of choruses. So an ensemble chorus is designed similar to a unison, except back then they didn't have the facility to do straight pitch shifts. But an ensemble, when you get it right, is just gorgeous. It's a case of finding the right mix to keep the sounding as though it's thin and simple without being that sort of ice pick. So the ensemble puts us in the right direction, small amount of movement there, and a 50-50 mix. While doing a full mix sounds nicer on its own, it becomes too busy. And the sound becomes too dominant, too exciting. Bit of echo on it. Smooths the whole thing off. Now here's where I got tricky. It's one of the few times where I've really played around with the sense of changing guys' notes. I added in a pitch shifter. Now this idea actually came from me taking the time to play with the echo, finding the right delay time. Because this has to hang and feel nice and organic, the last thing we want to do is to have BPM sync. It's like BPM sync's good for some things, but terrible for a lot of other things. So it's off, and I'm moving this knob up and down, and I hear this whoa kind of sound. That's like, well, that's what we want on this. Experimented with automating this, but it didn't give me the result that I wanted. I needed a clear feel. So knowing my gear, went back to this. Quite what the transposition is, I don't know, because it's not written out here anywhere, but very simply, some of the dry signal, you could do it without any dry signal at all, but mixing in some of the dry signal, not 100% of the way, just depends, comes down to taste really. And I've got a pair of the pitch shifters running, a little bit of fine shift with some feedback, tiny little bit of delay on the other one so that we're just really filling our sound out. And then this takes the pitch shifted stuff, not the dry, and moves the pitch. Just as though we had done this on the synth in the first place. And it takes a sound which becomes too static in this instance, because normally where you use this held string note or chord, commonly on a string machine, so you would have Billy Joel or whoever sitting there playing his piano-y stuff with one hand up here on his solo instrument, and the hand up here is not doing anything. It just sits up here and holds it whilst he does his thing down here. That's what Guy's done here, and it's good. But commonly there's other stuff going on around it. And the only stuff that we have going on around this here is actually more of the same. because as I said before, Guy's whole piece is really this long. So we don't have another thing happening here, so I've merely made something else happen. But rather than saying I'm going to compose extra notes because what's here is not good enough, and it wouldn't make any sense at this point to suddenly start introducing musical elements, to sort of suddenly say, oh, I'm going to introduce a jazz saxophone line at this point, would make no sense because there's no lead early in the piece to say, oh, we're going to play with bits and pieces of jazz. If we were, we'd have things all the way through, and then we might come to our jazz sax solo. So all I've done is very simply just played with pitching without the impression of introducing any notes. So it's possibly a seventh, but it could well be an octave. I don't know what it is, don't care, but it just adds a movement, and because there's regularity, we anticipate it and enjoy it. And then just copied it over here to fill in that intro so it wasn't just for a minute. That was physically the biggest change that I made to the whole piece. Pianos, interesting. These are quite fascinating. And remember, up to this point, we have had nothing resembling an actual instrument in this piece at all. Sorry, Guy, if you feel that that's offensive, it's not meant to be. This is the nature of deep house, that it is really holding you in this little box staring at a golf ball. And you've done it very well, it's very deep. But suddenly there's this surprise. And it's great that you actually took that piano and flipped it backwards. Because if we hadn't done that, we've already listened to 3.5 minutes. It's a shock, it makes no sense, it's got no context. But by reversing it, you've given us the surprise of, oh, what's this that's coming in? Because we haven't heard the piano, we don't actually know what that sound is. But boy, is it interesting. So it adds this, like, the golf ball suddenly gets real shiny. And then when it turns over with the piano sound, we go, I know that's a piano. Really well done. Really good composition technique. Don't know what led you to do it, but it's the right call. It works beautifully. And every time I hear it, like when I'm sitting back listening to the piece and I hear it, it's like, that's good. As that sound just swells out, it's like, wow, amazing. Really nicely done. But I did process that quite a bit. I whacked the pair of pianos together. Yay for an ordinary piano sample. So something had to be done with that piano sample to make it have real character. Because one of the problems with samples is that we're so busy focused on them being perfect and clean that unless we remember that we've got to make them into a real instrument, we just have these lifeless things. The first thing I actually did was to narrow its bandwidth. So you'll see that I've high passed at 200, and low passed at 5. So I've basically said my piano only lives here. Rather than saying it's allowed to live here, it lives here. Deliberate thinking, because having processed quite a few pianos for things, I know that a piano is better when it's focused than when it's everywhere. You wouldn't do that if it was just somebody playing Rachmaninoff. It would sound wrong. But this is in the context of a mix. We want that to punch. We want to be focused. Therefore, I'll say, don't worry, any of that stuff serves no purpose. Get rid of it. So I got rid of it. I did play around with lo-fi stuff. Ended up settling on 12-bit 22. Because what's the house piano? The piano that says house music? The M1. Not setting out to create an M1, but this gives it a little bit of the profile of that, and a little bit of messiness in terms of drives and doohickeyness that goes on under the hood of Fatso here. I put the frequency trimming after that, because it's not my intention here to make that sound bad. It's not supposed to sound like something pretending to be Stranger Things. I'm not here to make cliches. Summer of '84. But to create character in this otherwise relatively lifeless sample. So this begins to add some of that. And this really does this. It just pushes us more into that, let's make this piano really leap forward. And a lot of the trick is actually in the fact that it's overdrive. So that's ripped off even more of our low end than we already had. The overdrive in Scream just loses all bottom end, which is either an atrocity or great. I like it for what it does, so I use it for what it does. You can always put the bass back in, but I didn't want the bass in this piano. I want it to be forward. Again, thinking M1. And I even enhance the high frequency. I roll the tone down, but I enhance the high frequency. So we've got all kinds of complex layers of EQ, creating more character in this instrument. And the presence, if you've got a guitar cabinet, play with the presence knob. God knows what it does, but when you get it right, it sounds brilliant. When you get it wrong, it just sounds like shit. It's like the shitizer knob. But get it right, and presence really pulls the sound forward. And that's the whole aim here, was to pull that sound forward. Now, while a musician will probably go, oh yeah, that's a sample, it's not like everybody is going to be sitting at home going, oh, sample. It's an instrument that's got its own character now, but I wanted it to have more character. So I've used this fella, which is a frequency shifter, which is not a pitch shifter, it's a frequency shifter, given a tiny shift, so all the frequencies are shifted by 0.31 of a hertz, modulated, attached an LFO to the phase of it, and given it a subtle mix. So I've created a phaser. Put this through a phaser. So it's clearly an acoustic piano sample. it's an acoustic piano instrument because it's got liveliness to it, but then it's actually been treated like an electric piano. So it's several things at once, which makes it all kinds of interesting, especially as it fades in here. And that's the first point that our piece really actually has music in it. So it's quite a lift at that point, and I like it. I like it a lot. So that's our piano. That really exhausts all of our musical instruments, which leads us then to our sound effects. The number one sound effect in this is not the bells, it's these fellas here. So the first one, I'll ignore the ones that I moved forward. The first one that we hear.
So never mind what happened yesterday. So never mind what happened yesterday and all your problems, because, well, that's all gone. The only thing tonight that we have is us. Us.
So you're hearing the two layers of reverb. Hear how pushing one reverb through another gives you really nice sound. If you're thinking, geez, my reverbs aren't pro enough, take your not pro enough reverb, attach it to your instrument, and then push that combined instrument and reverb through the same not pro enough reverb, preferably on a different algorithm, because if you push a room through a room, you're just doubling the room. But even if you have to, it's, as long as they're different. But if you're on another algorithm, the pair of them will thicken up. This is kind of cool. But the coolest part is actually prone to falling away in the mix. Now here's this fella. This fella is unusual. Designed by a fellow who's pretty smart and has record credits and everything. And has worked with Emmylou Harris, the Emmylou Harris. Now that's like creme de la creme, whether you like country music or not. Emmylou is a name, and a darn good name too. So what this weird device does is called a leveler. It's complex to explain, but basically when you set it up right, which is a bit mind-boggling to start with, when you set it up right, it helps make sure that what's in there appears to be far more the same overall level on the way out, without creating the pushed and pumped feel that you get out of a compressor when you have to use it that hard to get vocals. So it evens things out.
That's all gone. The only thing tonight that we have is us.
So
Yesterday and all your problems, because, well,
that's the bit that I love. Listen to the difference.
all your problems, because, well,
I'm not very present.
all your problems, because, well,
This device pulls them forward. So if you haven't got something that does this, find yourself something that does this. This is just like a godsend when it comes to vocals. Reduces the amount of riding that you have to do, as long as you've got a good take. And if you're trying to mix somebody who's done a bad take, abandon the job. You know, if they do bad takes, and send them off to you. So if you're the artist and you're happy to do bad takes thinking that some mix engineer is going to make it good, no, not possible. And any good mix engineer will not want to mix it at all, because they know that they are polishing a turd. And it doesn't matter what you think of Vanilla's Ice Ice Baby, Vanilla Ice 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 Baby, the track's actually not a turd. It's actually a very cool, clever little track. Plenty of things that you could say are horribly wrong about it. It's morally wrong about it. But it's a corker of a track. If you send off a vocal take that's crap, or any kind of take that's crap, Don't expect anyone who's good to want to work with it. Or if you do force them to work with it, their heart's not in it. They know it's not savable.
So never mind what happened yesterday.
Don't know where this came from, but it works nicely. Therefore, we only need a little bit of
never mind what happened yesterday
to bring it up and make it really sound great. So it's a professionalizer plugin. Not generally a fan of such things, but Salig's a good mind, and he's built one that does this without intruding on the art of what should be there. So we pulled that up. Initially I just grabbed the first vocal, which was this, did this processing to it, then started to look at the other one and realised, look, they're really the same. Therefore I combined them and I'm working on the bass. So the second vocal is this one.
Sex, money, and drugs. That's what I love.
And the same technique there with the delay. Those bits that want to be emphasized, let's really emphasize them.
Drugs.
Including there at that one point, I've got it doing this. Because, even though I don't agree with it, that's a pretty cool hook in this song. So, take the time, not to overdo it, but listen to it, and when you hear that something needs doing, do it.
Drugs. Drugs.
The track's going on, but it's keeping that hook in mind. Because you can repeat a hook often, or you can have it every now and then. If it's every now and then you still want to keep it in mind somehow, and by putting an echo on it, we've made it from being a moment that happens just here to a moment that's now this long. So same here, but where you can go deep into echoes, that's a great moment there. If we didn't have the echo, turn that off. The lead up's all here.
Tonight that we have is us. Us.
Nice.
Us. Us.
It really rolls you into the pop sound. That pop sound is cool. I like that pop sound. It's a release. Deep house, this whole piece, because it doesn't move, is all tension. It's tension, 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 tension. But things like that pop, the repetition, the echo there, creates tension. We create a little bit more tension on top of that, and then pop. Good composition work. It only happens once. It's a unique moment in the piece, and it's cool. I like it a lot. There are various rises and the like. You'll see most of them I did virtually nothing with. Some I had to turn up because they were just, to me, mixed far too low to have the impact. Because we've got the same thing going on for 7 minutes, we really want to make the most of the changes that are there. You know, when you make that golf ball sparkle, make it sparkle good, boy. Synth riser before, a second drop, that's this one here.
Sex, money, and drugs. That's what I love.
Sounds great there. Very much the to be expected white noise thing. Happens again here.
Sex, money, drugs.
As you hear, actually not very effective. So we do this.
Sex. Drugs.
So what I did was I took a frequency shifter and made it do stuff. No doubt you watched the big knob fly. That just quite simply is messing up the frequencies and that spectrum. So it works effectively here. Same sound, just doesn't cut the mustard for two reasons. One, because we've got a lot of other different stuff going on at that second point in time, and also because we've heard it before. We need something different. So this is pushing those frequencies in ways that are not harmonic. Therefore, it gives us like
Sex. Drugs.
spaceship taking off kind of thing. It doesn't need to be super loud in the mix. I looked at, oh geez, do I have to push that in the mix to make this work here? No, better to make it so that it has a unique profile at that point, which was achievable just by changing the harmonic structure of that particular sound. Bright noise, not necessary. Transition effect from first drop to second chorus. Fine, but here how there's more movement in it now. Again, one of the problems with synths is that they tend to be everything's the same. So by putting it through this process, it's a frequency shifter, but I've deliberately not used the same frequency shifter as here. It needs to be different. And this is a weird device. I don't understand it very well, but nonetheless, it delivers this sound very, very nicely. So we've just moved the knob, automated that knob so that it's got character now. And rather than all just going in one direction, at the end, it's got this little scoop up as well. Quite subtle. In the mix, most people won't even notice that it happened, but it just adds this little bit of life. So, taking a sound that's reasonably two-dimensional, not bad in its own, but adding that extra layer of movement and excitement to the sound by using variants of drives and distortions subtly. Don't just splat everything. It sounds bloody awful, and it's such a tiring thing to listen to. Where everything sounds like it's broken whiskey glass, all these little granules. It's like yuck. I understand people did it. It was a new technology, new sound, but this is about not making those sounds sound like they're distorted in any way, but just using that to give them an edge, a character, as I've explained through lots of things. That's it. That is our whole mix. Then a case of listening over it, running it off, listening overnight. I came back and made a few little adjustments this morning. The more you do this, the fewer those adjustments will be. But there are a couple of things that I was, when I made those decisions, and I realized they were the wrong decisions, I was tired. I've obviously got a bit of a flu at the moment. My head hurts, my ears work funny. Came back this morning, or last night, after I'd watched some telly, listened to it again, and it's like, yeah, okay, great. They do make it sound super deep. They're pushing the drums and the bass louder. But unfortunately, they swallow all the extra stuff on top, which I would run that off. Like if I was asked to provide several mixes for the CD single kind of thing, then I'd say, okay, what you have here that's the mix. And then if they wanted the other versions, then I'd say, okay, here's the deep mix, where the other things are there, but they're really swallowed under drums and bass. And a few people would like the deep mix more, but you'd be mad to put it on the radio. Long talk, but this walks you through all the mix decisions that were made in delivering that mix that you heard at the beginning. Take your time with it. I hope you've learned something from this, and more importantly, if you're looking to improve your mixes or to have good mixes done, don't think in terms of how fewer number of hours can I get away with this. No, look at an outcome and hire somebody who's focused on getting outcomes. Your outcome being a good mix, not the outcome being having gotten you off his plate in an hour. A good mix goes for a lot of dollars for a good reason. And a good mix, what's included in those dollars are different versions. It's just automatic. The guy may not deliver them, but he will possibly have gone through several different versions. If you look on my website page where you may have found this, you'll see that I talk about commonly doing 3 mixes of something. The mix which is straight everything that's there. Let's make this better mix. And then if I hear something interesting, I'll go off and do a really creative mix. And that's where you might end up with something that is out of the box, where I'll go off and do things. Now I've done a little from columns A through C here, all in the one mix, because I'm not planning on doing 3 mixes. This is my videos, my thing. It's not a commercial project. But if it's a commercial project, then you are going to spend quite a lot of money, but you're spending it to get a lot of outcomes. You're not spending it just to like to park your car for an hour there somewhere. If you are interested in having something done with me, please find me, have a conversation. Have a good day now.